want to welcome everyone to the next era in ESG investing. We're examining the recent SEC proposal, as well as meet with thought leaders in the ESG investing space, from educators, portfolio managers, and financial advisors, and everyone in between. We want to examine what these rules mean for us now, as well as how they might change in the near future, and finally, how these rules might look in the future and the effect they have in the long term. So here, I'm glad to have Cary Krosinsky with us. And we're here to have a great conversation around the proposed SEC rules and lean on his insights and educational background. So Cary, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jack. Great to meet you, by the way, and always great to be with you, Pat. The most concise way to introduce myself is as an independent educator, author, and senior advisor. So, work that Gabe Rissman, Patrick Reed, and I did back maybe 5+ years ago after their time at Yale, led to some entrepreneurial endeavors that became your stake. So it's always great to be interacting with young people and helping encourage their work, which we can talk about further, I'm sure. But look me up on LinkedIn if you want to know more about my background. I'm involved in a lot of different things and always trying to encourage progress.
That's great. That's really great. No, we're lucky to have you here. And kind of your specialization in the ESG space, what is it that really gets you excited about this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. For me, the most important thing is to go at the challenges we're facing from an environmental, social dimension, or how companies are governed in a positive way. So one of the things I've learned over time, having been, and now in my third career, I've kind of been in this space for 20 years, and kind of the field started with sort of negative practices, and the more we see efforts transforming into positive initiatives and endeavors, the more we're likely to have a positive result. I mean, for me, the SEC proposed rule is in that category, encouraging transparency, encouraging more action. For me, that's a positive activity. So we're always looking to try to make sure, even in my own thinking, talking, and work, is that we're looking to encourage positive approaches.
That's so great. Yeah, I think we view it as the same way, where it's really about transparency. And as you well know, US Drake's really focused on transparency and telling the full data story, if you will, right? And so having a great SEC back to say, let's consider kind of the 3 levels of ESG funds. How is it that they're going to affect investors and advisors? And how is it, and any advisor's goal, right, is to offer the best product for their end client. I think these, proposed rules really offer a great way to do that. But with that in mind, do you think that the SEC needs to propose anything else to make it more stringent, to say, this is a great start, but we need to also consider other things?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, the word that while you were just talking that came to mind was authenticity. And so it's something that would help sustainable finance, my preferred phrase for the field, but I don't care what we call it. If we have authenticity, then we have maximum buy-in. We have people willing to put more money in with confidence. Without authenticity, we have concern, and understandable concern, calls about greenwashing that we've all seen. And so every step in this direction that leads towards authenticity is the only way that our field can actually legitimately succeed at achieving its goals. So more transparency is helpful. I definitely think the SEC probably saw this as a starting point for what will be a longer conversation. Sadly, it'll take years for this to actually happen, but it's a good step. And the most important thing I think the SEC needs to do next is to think a bit more broadly across other asset classes, because public companies are 20% of market value in the world, something like that. So what about the other 80%?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Patrick, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd love to have your perspective on the timeline. These rulings just came out, these proposed rulings, just about a week ago. And there's some talk of the comment period being extended, and SFDR in Europe, which is their version of a regulatory approach to defining sustainable investing, that took, I think, six or more years from the first proposal. And now that that's on the books at various stages of implementation, there's some precedent. But one of the things that we are getting a lot of questions from folks in the US is, when is this coming, and how close will this proposal look like to what actually gets finalized? So having been involved in these types of processes in Europe and over your career in sustainable finance, it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on what you think will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. Basically, my expectation is that the proposed rule has already been useful and positive in generating more activity, which is great. And that's exactly what you want. Ultimately, it's the most important thing. Corporations are having to think about what they do. And that's super, super helpful, right? Like what strategies will they think about doing, not doing, reporting on, they haven't reported on, gaining an understanding of their supply chain, for example, where maybe they thought they could push it to item number 500 out of 1,000. Now it's item 20. This is really useful, actually, from a corporate perspective. So it's a very helpful thing that it's even out there. Expectation on time frame would be, I would say, 2 to 3 years for the rule as it's proposed. So with some caveats, and it's great to see investor activity on the rise also over the last few years. There isn't a single financial institution that can ignore ESG issues any longer. They have to do something. And that's a big change from when we started working together and we're doing ratings on funds. The trick here, of course, is this is policy, and policy is subject to election cycles. So, we have an election cycle coming up at the end of this year and another one in 2024. I wouldn't expect these rules to actually get implemented until after the 2024 election. So, as was the case when John Kerry helped push the Paris Agreement through, and he put in a little thing that said, just in case the 2016 president wasn't favorable, the US couldn't be removed from the Paris Agreement. We have to sort of think forward politically as to what might happen, because ultimately policy is a question of who people vote for in this country anyway.
Do we think that if the political administration changes parties, the proposal as written would be totally scrapped? And would there be a replacement proposal that looks very different, or would we just see nothing happening?
Yeah, there's probably a few scenarios to think through there. One being, what's the global response to these pressing climate issues? As you mentioned, the EU isn't going to change its TAC. What's in the EU taxonomy or not is a political football, and the Ukraine situation obviously has thrown a lot of the Green New Deal plans up in the air. So things will continue to change even in the EU. China is expected to dramatically push on ESG and climate improvement as part of a way to recover its economy from its zero COVID policy. So if the rest of the world is pushing on these things, can the US be the villain? Is a question. And how will voters take to that? There's a lot that will play out over the next few years that is uncertain. And as a result, if you're a company, and then obviously this rule is pointed at companies, you have to act because you just don't know what will happen. So you have to be prepared. And so that's a good thing. So is it possible the rule will get completely thrown out, overturned? In a way, it doesn't matter, because ultimately policy is just there as a mechanism to ensure things happen that should otherwise happen anyway. And there are other forces at play when it comes to corporate activity. That includes their employees. One of the reasons I teach 10 plus classes a year now is that one of my theories of change is getting young people like yourselves in the workplace who can agitate for positive change. And that's happening. So it's, you want to retain your talent, you have to pay attention to these things. You have to actually not back ridiculous far right policies as a corporation, unless you're Elon Musk and you can decide to fire 10% of your staff on a whim after you've flipped the coin. But regardless of that, it's important to realize there's more to the policy conversation than just the policy itself. There's also many external factors, consumer behavior and choice, observation of the system moment when it comes to climate. Do we have a majority of Americans that demand action and are willing to vote that way or not? We don't know, but all we can do is anticipate. If you're a company, you have to be thinking the same. What is Ford doing? Are they just making trucks? It seems that they've realized that the future is electric, and they're getting behind that full speed ahead. They have to look forward a number of years. So ultimately, it's harder and harder to see that companies are going to be able to go back to business as usual, quote unquote, because there is no such thing.
And these rulings from last Thursday did have a section on making the corporate carbon emission disclosures the only metric that fund managers are required to calculate and disclose on specifically, regardless of any other things they do. The bulk of these rulings were focused on the fund manager's strategy and disclosures around whether they're doing what they say they're doing. And there is this key 3-category proposal of ESG integration, ESG focused, and impact focused as the labels that funds themselves need to describe according to, and then disclose, and different recording requirements for each of those categories. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on just from the SEC's perspective at a high level, if that's the right way to categorize things. And then also, now that we have this proposal out there, I imagine this will be a big part of the comment letters that come through around, hey, we should categorize it differently, or this doesn't perfectly describe it. But even if this is years before finalization and implementation, does this, in your opinion, change how funds start describing themselves in the meantime, and how rating and diligence processes, RFPs, asset owners start asking for these self-disclosures even before there's a requirement?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, just one thing on the carbon emissions part of the rule. I believe that it's phrased slightly interestingly, that you only have to disclose your carbon emissions if you say you're using them as a criteria.
Mm-hmm. And then the good faith approach if you can't calculate it, which
so
is interesting to think about.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so it's like not everyone has to disclose the carbon emissions in their portfolio, only if you're using it. So in effect, some managers do, most don't, and the ones that don't can just say, well, we have an idea of the carbon intensity of companies, which we do, independent of actually using that information in any meaningful way, which nobody ever has. In my experience, having been tasked years ago to write a paper on this, no one was using that information. And in fact, it's partly the reason I went independent 10 years ago, having been with TrueCost, which was and arguably still is the expert at this. Investors simply weren't using this information to make decisions at all, beyond what you might know on the back of a napkin. So there's that. But it is really fascinating to see the three categories that the SEC ended up with. It was sort of a cook down of what others have as a longer list. We have the 7 tribes of sustainable investing. I have a hard time seeing why that's not correct. And that was based on work that Eurosif did previously, which I think describes pretty well all of the categories an investor might use to invest in a sustainability issue or an impact manner. And the CFA just came out with their standards. They have 6 out of the 7 that we have. They didn't include minimum standards except with some sort of ancient norms-based screening category. Anyway, so there are many, many different ways that we've seen funds categorized, including with the SFDR and their articles. Really interesting question. Will funds start self-disclosing in the manner that the SEC has kind of cooked down? I would imagine we would probably start to see that. Do I think they have it right? I don't think they have it wrong, in having thought it through. I do think more granularity would be helpful, though, because there is a big difference between a fund that decides it doesn't want to invest in certain sectors or a fund that's only looking for companies that are best in its sector or otherwise good investments from a sustainability and a financial standpoint. Those are 2 very different approaches. So already the SEC didn't separate those 2 categories, which I'm a little bit puzzled by. And then they've kind of bundled more things into impact than I would. I mean, for me, there's a big difference between impact investing that mostly attempts to provide services to those less well off versus thematic funds and renewable energy project finance. Like, what does that have to do with providing better incomes for farmers in India? Why is that one category?
That's a really good point. And then as far as
Sorry,
I was just going to add in there, the SEC made it clear they didn't want to define ESG, but they would kind of define the spectrum of what counts as an ESG investment. Do you feel that they should work to try to make a definition of ESG, or is that too close-minded to say, well, if this is the definition and this fund maybe doesn't reach the criteria, though it might reach the criteria for an end investor? Is that a missed opportunity, or is that the right way to think about it?
I don't always agree with Hester Pierce, one of the SEC commissioners, but I would say a percentage of the time I do, and in this case I do. I don't see how the SEC can even talk about an acronym without defining the acronym. I'm not a big fan of the phrase ESG investing. Everyone seems to have settled on it recently, but I don't really care. But for me, ESG are issues. They're a series of environmental issues, social issues, governance issues. They can be clearly defined. It might be 100, whatever the number is. Sometimes data can help, but not always. Sometimes it's quite helpful. Sometimes investing can help, but not always. And it's often critical. But spending some time to define that, what are the issues? Basically, the GRI has done that already. It wouldn't be too hard to just take their grand taxonomy of ESG issues, for example, and try to codify that. It's not that complicated. And at the end of the day, if you're going to be an agency that is patrolling greenwashing, you have to make it clear what that means. I'm afraid I agree with Commissioner Pierce on this one. That just kind of throwing the phrase ESG around, which is what everyone's doing these days, isn't particularly helpful, actually.
Very well said.
Yeah, it seems like they, at many points in the document, claim they're not defining ESG, but at the same time, they're proposing effectively how you need to disclose your ESG strategy. So there's an implicit definition there, and it's a very loose one.
Yeah, and at the same time, obviously, DWS is having their headquarters.
Right.
They're having to give up papers, and you have the head of DWS resigning, and claims of greenwashing are understandably a concern for people from any side of the conversation. So why would that was? I mean, this field, as I'm sure we would all agree, there's always room for evolution, growth, expansion, change of perspective. Like corn-based ethanol was supposed to be a positive, turned out it wasn't. So we're always learning, things are always moving around. I get that, but at the same time, there are things called glossaries.
Yeah, and that it does seem like that's the main difference with the European approach, which I think is the German offices of DWS are the ones being rated. So it's really that schema, their own SFDR taxonomy, very different approach. But as you mentioned at the beginning, there's all this football back and forth of what's in and what's out of that. You know, does French nuclear energy count as clean energy? Yes or no? We still haven't decided, have we?
Yeah, and Germany may buy nuclear energy from France rather than have their own reactors. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the EU really isn't terribly aligned on a lot of things at the end of the day, but they got this together, so that's great. I think it's a major step in the right direction. The SFDR, the articles, the taxonomy is what it is. I mean, I definitely think we need more of a focus on transition to really understand what that means, what's possible, what's not possible. But the whole field is like a set of building blocks, so it's one more useful building block. And you know, the U.S. didn't rush to do the same. It's probably fine, but to just kind of say no, we're not going to define anything. Hard to understand that's the answer here.
In terms of fund managers' operation in the United States, I'm trying to imagine, and we'll see it, but I'm trying to sort of figure out what the changes will be in the next 6 months around how they're describing their impact. Usually the fund impact reports start coming out around this time of year for the last year. For 2021's report will come out in June or July of this year, and the proposed regulations are incorporating they made reference to shareholder engagement as both in terms of voting and in terms of private meetings with companies. And this is one more framework in essence, in addition to the UNPRI, or I guess just the PRI these days. This is just a jumble of, there's all these balls in the air. Do you have any picture in your mind of how the juggler is going to land them in their hands?
Yeah, no, there's been some pushback on how they described engagement, that it's not enough to do one engagement, you have to do a certain number and all of that. The proposed rule felt like a starting point in many ways, just to get something out there that's reasonable, which it is, but it'll likely continue to evolve. As far as fund managers, again, I think 5 years ago was certainly not the case when we were doing our fund ratings, that every fund manager, had an actual team, was actually looking at this in a serious way. Thanks to a whole bunch of things, the pandemic, the greenwashing claims, younger people getting into the workplace, etc. It's pretty much impossible not to have, Putnam I sat next to Scott Sippel at a PRI event, and he was like, we can do this. And he tried to transform the entire firm. So this is happening everywhere, at least to some degree. There's some pushback from Texas and West Virginia and all of that. But I don't think that the momentum could possibly slow down longer term for all the likely fits and starts that we'll see. So, what does BlackRock claim? 40% of its assets are sustainable, or whatever the percentage is. That's quite something, if that's true. The people there are legitimately working on these things. Other firms are in different situations, but at the end of the day, it's about market demand. So the fact that your stake is working on trying to encourage that is what we need. We need more participatory investors. For me, the overarching goal would be to have a majority of people wanting sustainability considerations in their investments, then things would really start happening. So every step in that direction helps fund managers do more, report more, build up their teams, make sure they're incorporating. I think ultimately where we're getting to is that ESG issues are just part of what everyone has to consider. And then they have to demonstrate to their clients the number one thing the clients want to know, like, what are you actually doing? Are you delivering on your impact? So that, all these trends are heading in the right direction in that regard. We're not moving fast enough. That's another question. But I think ultimately fund managers are going to have to do this work. They'll receive internal pushback if they don't do it legitimately. They'll get pushback, and those are good things.
Well, those are all really good things to hear. And kind of the final question that we have, right, is saying, okay, once this is enacted, let's say, 4, 5, 6 years at the most, right? But hopefully before that, the future of ESG investing there, do you think it's let's just say all the proposed rules pass, there's not major changes. Do you think it does a good job to help aid in that transparency and the authenticity, or do you feel like it's a great starting point, but there needs to be, excess growth down there to be, almost more in line with kind of the European standards?
Yeah, I mean, it's a starting point. I think this, as you said, it's the right way to think about it. Ultimately, the North Star for me are, how do we create the capital we need for the climate transition?
Mm-hmm.
How do we think more than just Western, because Asia is half the world's economy? How do we make sure that everyone in the financial system understands what we're talking about? We're all working on education in that regard. So for me, the North Star is kind of looking at the 5 pillars of the global economy. That's companies and investors and policymakers and consumers and innovators. And are they all doing everything they can? Because that's all we can do at the end of the day, and the intersections between. So the rule, even just the rule coming out, helps accelerate corporate activity, at least gets them thinking about what to do, even if it's negative. So I think it's helpful. I think it'll take years to actually codify, and we have election cycles to get through. But I think it's an important activity that has triggered action and thinking that wouldn't otherwise have happened. So I think it's already done some good. And it'll take years to see what the actual effect is, but I think at the end of the day, we'll see more corporate activity. Ultimately, the supply chain is very important. Public companies really don't have more than 1/3 of global impact, really. A lot of the impact's in supply chain and in people and their activities. So, we ultimately have a long way to go, but these are helpful steps.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.